The prison bully thought he was just another scared newcomer. Easy target. He humiliated him, took his jacket, laughed in his face. What he didn't realize, the calm young man standing in front of him was a mafia heir who'd gotten himself arrested on purpose, and everyone who crossed his family ended up regretting it. The steel gates of Iron Heights Penitentiary slammed shut behind Marco DeLuca with a finality that would break most men. But Marco wasn't most men. At 24, he looked out of place among the hardened criminals shuffling through intake. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, his posture straight, and his hazel eyes carried an unsettling calmness that the processing guards noticed, but couldn't quite place. While other inmates fidgeted, cursed, or broke down, Marco simply observed everything with the precision of someone reading a restaurant menu. DeLuca Marco. Cell Block D, Bunk 47. The intake officer barked, shoving a bundle of orange fabric at him. Welcome to hell, pretty boy. Marco took the uniform without a word, his fingers brushing against the coarse material. In his previous life, he wore Italian suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Now, he was prisoner 24,601. The irony wasn't lost on him. The walk to cell block D felt like entering a concrete jungle. The walls were stained with decades of despair, the air thick with the smell of industrial cleaner trying and failing to mask something far more human. Catcalls and threats echoed from every cell as Marco passed, but he kept his eyes forward, mentally cataloging faces, identifying potential allies and inevitable enemies. He'd studied Iron Heights for 6 months before his arrest. Every guard rotation, every gang territory, every blind spot in the security cameras. This wasn't a mistake or bad luck that landed him here. This was deliberate. His cell was 8 by 10 feet of gray concrete. A thin mattress, a steel toilet, and a small metal desk bolted to the wall. His cellmate, a wiry man with teardrop tattoos, looked him up and down with obvious contempt. "Hope you ain't one of them talkers," the man grunted. "I like my peace." "We'll get along fine," Marco replied, his voice carrying a subtle accent that suggested expensive private schools and European boarding houses. That first night, Marco lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, listening to the symphony of prison life, distant shouts, rattling bars, the occasional scream. He reached into his sock and pulled out a small, creased photograph he'd managed to smuggle past the scanners. It showed a distinguished man in his 50s with silver hair and Marco's same intense eyes. Don Salvatore DeLuca, his father, dead for 18 months now. Marco's jaw tightened as he stared at the photo. The official story said heart attack, but Marco knew better. His father had been betrayed, poisoned slowly over months by someone he trusted. And that someone was here, in this very prison, breathing air he didn't deserve. The next morning came with a jarring clang of cell doors sliding open. Breakfast was a chaotic affair in the cafeteria, a massive room where invisible boundaries separated rival factions like countries on a map. The Aryan Brotherhood claimed the North Wall. The Latin Kings controlled the East. The Irish crew sat near the kitchens. And in the center, commanding the best tables with the clearest view of everything, sat Slug. Victor "Slug" Morrison was exactly what his nickname suggested, slow-moving but impossible to shake off once he latched onto you. 300 pounds of muscle gone soft, covered in prison ink that told stories of violence and dominance. He'd ruled Iron Heights for 5 years through a simple philosophy. Everyone either worked for him, feared him, or bled because of him. Marco grabbed his tray of gray slop masquerading as oatmeal and looked for an empty seat. That's when Slug's voice boomed across the cafeteria. "Well, well, well. Fresh meat looks like he got lost on his way to a country club." The room fell silent. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. This was entertainment, and in prison, entertainment was currency. Marco could feel hundreds of eyes on him as he continued toward an empty table. He'd learned long ago that bullies fed on reactions. Starved them, and they either moved on or escalated. He was counting on escalation. "Hey, pretty boy. I'm talking to you." Marco set his tray down and sat, methodically unwrapping his plastic spork from its napkin. That's when Slug appeared beside him, two of his lieutenants flanking him like attack dogs. Up close, Slug smelled like cigarettes and cheap soap. His breath could strip paint. "You deaf or stupid?" Slug leaned down, his massive frame casting a shadow over Marco's breakfast. "When I talk, you answer. When I walk, you move. That's how things work here." Marco took a slow breath and looked up, meeting Slug's eyes with an unsettling steadiness. "I heard you. I just didn't realize you were talking to me." The cafeteria collectively inhaled. Nobody talked back to Slug. Not on their first day. Not ever. Slug's face reddened. His hand shot out and grabbed Marco's collar, lifting him partially off the bench. "Listen here, college boy. I don't know what rich daddy got you thrown in here, but that life is over. You're in my house now, and in my house, you show respect." "Let go of my shirt," Marco said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that Slug either didn't notice or didn't care about. Instead, Slug laughed, a wet, rattling sound, and shoved Marco backward. He stumbled but didn't fall, catching himself on the table. "Or what?" Slug grinned, revealing 3 gold teeth. "You gonna cry? Maybe call your lawyer?" Marco straightened his shirt, his expression unchanged. Every instinct in his body screamed to break Slug's nose, to show everyone exactly who they were dealing with. But that would ruin everything. Patience was a weapon, and Marco had been sharpening it for 18 months. "No," Marco said simply. "I'm going to finish my breakfast." He sat back down. The cafeteria erupted in laughter. Slug's face twisted in rage at the disrespect, and he grabbed the expensive-looking jacket Marco had been allowed to keep, a gray bomber with leather trim. This is mine now. Consider it rent for breathing my air." Marco watched Slug walk away wearing his jacket, his lieutenants laughing and shoving each other. The other inmates returned to their conversations, and just like that, Marco DeLuca had been marked as prey. But as Marco ate his tasteless oatmeal, a ghost of a smile crossed his lips. Slug had just made his first mistake. He'd noticed Marco. Back in his cell that afternoon, Marco sat on his bunk and pulled out that photograph again. His father's face stared back at him, proud and uncompromising. "Day 1 complete," Marco whispered to the image. He doesn't know it yet, but Slug just signed his own death warrant. And Rico, his voice dropped to something cold and final. "Rico, I'm coming for you. Just like I promised." He kissed the photograph and tucked it back into his hiding spot, a loose brick behind his bunk he'd already identified during his first night. Somewhere in this prison, Rico, the rat Sandoval, was sleeping peacefully, believing he was safe under Slug's protection. He had no idea that the young man who'd just been humiliated in the cafeteria was the son of the man he'd murdered. The game had begun, and Marco DeLuca was playing chess, while everyone else played checkers. The fluorescent lights in cell block D never truly went dark. They dimmed to a sickly yellow at 10 p.m., casting long shadows that turned every corner into a potential ambush point. Marco lay on his bunk, eyes closed but fully awake, listening to the rhythm of the prison settling into night. His cellmate, who'd introduced himself as Tommy Twitch Rodriguez, was already snoring, a wet, rattling sound that echoed off the concrete walls. Marco had learned everything he needed to know about Twitch in their brief conversations. Small-time drug dealer. 3 years into a 5-year stretch. Harmless. Invisible. Perfect. At 11:47 p.m., Marco heard it. Footsteps. 2 sets, moving with the careful deliberation of men trying to be quiet but lacking the training to actually pull it off. The footsteps stopped outside his cell. Marco's eyes remained closed, his breathing steady and deep. He'd learned to sleep like a soldier during his time in the family business, ready to wake at the slightest irregularity, but appearing completely vulnerable. The cell door clicked open. A guard on Slug's peril, no doubt. "That's him," a voice whispered. "The pretty boy in the bottom bunk." Slug said, "Don't kill him." Another voice responded. Just make sure he remembers his place. Marco felt rather than saw them enter. Two men, both around 200 pounds, based on how the floor vibrated with their steps. One moved to his left side, the other to his right. They were positioning themselves to grab him simultaneously, standard prison beatdown tactics. The moment the first hand touched his shoulder, Marco moved. His eyes snapped open as he grabbed the wrist of the man on his left, twisting it violently inward while simultaneously driving his elbow into the man's throat. The attacker made a strangled gasping sound and stumbled backward, clutching his neck. The second attacker, a bald man with a swastika tattoo on his neck, threw a wild punch. Marco rolled off the bunk, letting the fist slam into the thin mattress where his head had been seconds before. In one fluid motion, he swept the man's legs out from under him. The bald man hit the concrete floor hard. Before he could recover, Marco was on him, knee pressed into his spine, arm wrapped around his throat in a textbook rear-naked choke. The man clawed desperately at Marco's forearm, his face turning purple. "Sleep," Marco whispered, tightening his grip with surgical precision. 10 seconds later, the man went limp. The first attacker had recovered enough to charge, murder in his eyes and a sharpened toothbrush in his hand. Marco waited until the last possible second, then sidestepped like a matador avoiding a bull. He grabbed the man's extended arm and used his momentum against him, slamming him face first into the cell wall. The crack of breaking bone echoed through the cell. The man screamed and dropped to his knees, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. Marco stood over both unconscious and injured men, barely breathing hard. On the top bunk, Twitch had somehow slept through the entire encounter, his snoring never missing a beat. From the corridor came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. A guard appeared at the cell door, flashlight in hand. He surveyed the scene, two of Slug's enforcers on the floor, Marco standing calmly in the center, and their eyes met. The guard was older, maybe 50, with gray hair and tired eyes. For a long moment, they stared at each other in silence. "Looks like they slipped," the guard finally said, his voice flat. "Clumsy," Marco agreed. "I'll get medical. You might want to wash up." The guard disappeared, and Marco heard him speaking into his radio about an accident in cell block D. No mention of Marco. No mention of a fight. Interesting. Marco walked to the small steel sink in the corner and washed the blood from his knuckles, watching it swirl down the drain in pink spirals. His hands were steady. His heartbeat had already returned to normal. This wasn't his first time hurting people, and it wouldn't be his last. As medical personnel arrived to cart away Slug's men, Marco sat on his bunk and reached behind it, pulling out the loose brick. He retrieved the photograph of his father and studied it in the dim light. "Two down," he whispered, tracing his finger along his father's face. "I defended myself tonight, Papa.
Just like you taught me.
But soon, very soon, I won't be defending anymore." He thought about Rico Sandoval, probably sleeping peacefully 3 cell blocks away, believing he was untouchable under Slug's protection. Rico had been his father's most trusted lieutenant, the man who ate at their family table, who'd sworn blood oaths of loyalty. And then he'd poisoned on Salvatore De Luca slowly over 6 months, selling him out to the FBI while watching him wither and die. Marco's jaw clenched. "I'll finish what you started," he promised the photograph, repeating the words like a mantra. "The De Luca name will mean something again. And Rico will die knowing exactly who killed him and why." He tucked the photo back into its hiding spot and lay down, staring at the underside of Twitch's bunk. Tomorrow, word would spread about what happened tonight. Slug would hear that his men failed. Questions would be asked about the quiet, clean-cut kid who'd taken down 2 experienced inmates without breaking a sweat.
Good.
Let them wonder. Let them worry. Marco De Luca had 18 months of rage to unleash, and this was only the beginning. The prison grapevine worked faster than any communication system Marco had ever seen. By breakfast, everyone knew about the failed attack. By lunch, the story had grown into legend. Marco had supposedly fought off 4 men, maybe 5, possibly while blindfolded. Marco let the rumors spread. Myths were useful. But he also knew that bruising Slug's ego would only buy him time, not safety. He needed allies. Real ones. And in prison, alliances weren't built on friendship, they were built on value. On his third day, Marco made his first calculated move. The prison laundry was controlled by the Latin Kings, a tight-knit crew led by a stocky man named Carlito Vega. They ran a profitable side business, washing money, literally. Guards would slip cash to inmates' families on the outside in exchange for contraband coming in. The laundry room was where those transactions were coordinated, hidden in the steam and noise of industrial washers. Marco volunteered for laundry duty. You? The assignment guard looked skeptical. Rich boy wants to wash dirty sheets. I need to stay busy, Marco said simply. Idle hands and all that. The guard shrugged and added his name to the roster. When Marco entered the laundry room that afternoon, the temperature hit him like a wall, oppressive heat mixed with the chemical smell of detergent. A dozen men worked the machines, mostly Latino inmates who stopped their conversations the moment he walked in. Carlito emerged from the back, wiping his hands on a towel. He was 40-something, with graying temples and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. You're the guy from cell block D, Carlito said in accented English. The one who put Manny and Dutch in the infirmary. They came to me, Marco replied, loading sheets into a washer. I just wanted to sleep. Carlito studied him for a long moment. Slug's not happy. You made him look weak. Slug should hire better help. A few of the Latino inmates chuckled. Carlito's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Respect, maybe, or at least curiosity. Marco worked silently for 20 minutes, learning the rhythm of the laundry room. Then, while loading a dryer next to where Carlito was checking inventory, he spoke quietly. Your outside connection is compromised. Carlito's hand froze. What? Guard Patterson. He's skimming 20% off your transfers and blaming it on your street crew. In 3 weeks, maybe 4, your people outside will think you're holding out on them. That's when things fall apart. Carlito's jaw tightened. How the hell would you know that? Marco met his eyes. Because Patterson did the same thing to the Irish crew 6 months ago. Started a war that got 2 people killed. He's doing it again, just with different players. And you're telling me this out of the goodness of your heart. I'm telling you this because I need you to know that I pay attention. I notice things. And I don't forget. Marco finished loading the dryer and walked away, leaving Carlito staring after him. 2 days later, Marco was in the prison library, a musty room filled with outdated books that smelled like forgotten time. The Irish crew used it as neutral ground for meetings. Their leader, a red-haired man named Finn O'Brien, sat in the back corner, pretending to read a Tom Clancy novel. Marco grabbed a random book and sat one table away. Your poker game is being watched, Marco said without looking up from his book. Finn didn't react immediately. After a moment, he turned a page. I don't play poker. The Wednesday night game in cell block B. Guard Willis thinks he's playing too. He's actually recording everything to build a gambling case against you. He needs one more conviction to make captain. Finn's knuckles went white gripping his book. Why would you tell me this? Because I'm not your enemy. And neither is Carlito's crew. But Slug wants you two fighting over the East Yard territory, so neither of you notices he's expanding into both your operations. Marco stood, replaced his book, and walked out. That evening, in the prison yard, Marco sat alone on a bench, watching the invisible boundaries between factions. He noticed everything. Who talked to whom, which guards looked the other way at which activities, where the cameras had blind spots. A skinny kid, barely 20, approached nervously. Hey man, I heard you know things. Marco looked at him. What do you need? My sister. She's supposed to visit next week, but the guard denied the paperwork. Said I needed to pay a processing fee, but that's not real, right? It's just Guard Tompkins' third shift. He charges everyone that fee. Tell your sister to file a complaint with the warden's office. Reference case number 2847B. Similar complaint from last year. He got written up but not fired. The threat of another formal complaint will make him approve it free. The kid's eyes widened. Seriously? Seriously. Words spread faster this time. The new guy knew things. Useful things. Things that could make life in Iron Heights slightly less hellish. By the end of day 5, Marco DeLuca had quietly made himself valuable to 3 different factions without pledging loyalty to any of them. And Slug, sitting in his corner of the yard surrounded by his dwindling crew, was beginning to realize that the quiet kid he'd humiliated wasn't quite so quiet anymore. The prison chapel was the only place in Iron Heights that felt remotely peaceful. Wooden pews worn smooth by decades of desperate prayers, stained glass windows that filtered the harsh sunlight into something almost gentle, and a smell of incense that covered up the usual prison stench of sweat and despair. Marco entered on Sunday evening, when most inmates were in the yard or their cells. He wasn't religious, not anymore, but he knew who he'd find here. Father Patrick O'Connell knelt at the altar, his white hair catching the colored light from the windows. He was 70 if he was a day, with the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd heard every confession humanity had to offer and somehow still believed in redemption. "Mr. DeLuca," the priest said without turning around. "I wondered when you'd come." Marco stopped mid-step. "You know who I am." "I knew your father." Father O'Connell stood slowly, his knees crackling. He turned to face Marco, his blue eyes sharp despite his age. Salvatore was a complicated man. Generous to the church, ruthless to his enemies. I gave last rites to more of his victims than I care to count. Then why did you keep counseling his men? Because even sinners deserve God's mercy. Maybe especially sinners. The priest gestured to a pew.
Sit.
We both know you didn't come here for a sermon. Marco sat, and Father O'Connell settled beside him with a heavy sigh. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the chapel's peace wrapping around them like a blanket. How did you know I was here?" Marco finally asked. "A young DeLuca gets arrested for assaulting a federal agent in New York, pleads guilty immediately, requests 0 legal defense, and specifically asks to serve time at Iron Heights." Father O'Connell shook his head. "That's not bad luck, son. That's planning." Marco's jaw tightened. "He's here. Rico Sandoval, the rat who killed my father." "I know. You know?" Marco's voice rose slightly. "Did you know what he did? Did you know he poisoned my father over 6 months, watched him waste away while pretending to be loyal? Did you know he sold out the entire DeLuca operation to the FBI for immunity and witness protection?" "I suspected," Father O'Connell said quietly. "Your father came to confession 2 weeks before he died. He said he felt betrayed, that someone close was destroying him from within. He didn't know who. I prayed with him, but," the priest's voice cracked, "I couldn't save him." Marco pulled the photograph from his pocket, the edges now worn from constant handling. His father stared back at him, frozen in a moment when he was still healthy, still powerful. "He was a good father," Marco said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know what he did for a living. I'm not naive. But to me, to my mother before she died, to our family, he was good. He taught me to play chess, to speak 3 languages, to always keep my word. And Rico," his hand shook. "Rico ate at our table. He held me when I was a baby. I called him Uncle Rico." "Betrayal cuts deepest from those we love," Father O'Connell said. "The FBI thought they were protecting him by sending him here under a false identity. They didn't know I'd figured out where he was. They didn't know I'd spend 6 months planning how to get arrested and sent to this exact prison." Marco's voice turned cold. "Rico thinks he's safe under Slug's protection. He thinks he's just another inmate serving out a sentence. He has no idea I'm here." "Marco," the priest's voice carried a warning. "Vengeance is the Lord's." "Don't," Marco cut him off. "Don't quote scripture at me, Father. My father is dead because of that man. The DeLuca name, a name that meant something, that protected thousands of people, that built hospitals and schools, is now just a punchline in federal courtrooms. Our enemies carved up our territory like a Thanksgiving turkey. Our allies scattered like roaches." He stood, pacing in front of the altar. "I'm not just here to kill Rico. I'm here to rebuild. To show everyone that the DeLuca family isn't finished. That betrayal has consequences. That loyalty still means something. Father O'Connell watched him with sad, knowing eyes. And Slug? Is he just collateral damage in your plan? Slug is a tool. He controls this prison, which means he controls Rico's protection. Once I break Slug, I break that protection. Then Rico and I have a conversation he's been avoiding for 18 months. This path you're on, Father O'Connell said slowly, it won't bring your father back. It won't heal the wound in your heart. No, Marco agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. But it will honor his memory. It will show my father's enemies that the DeLuca family keeps its promises. And when Rico takes his last breath, looking into my eyes, he'll understand that betrayal doesn't end with death. It follows you beyond the grave. The chapel fell silent except for the distant sounds of prison life filtering through the walls. Father O'Connell stood and placed a weathered hand on Marco's shoulder. Then I'll pray for you, Marco DeLuca. I'll pray that when this is over, there's still enough of your soul left to save. Save your prayers for Rico, Marco said, heading toward the door. He's going to need them more than me. As the chapel door closed behind him, Father O'Connell knelt once more at the altar, his lips moving in silent prayer for a young man walking willingly into darkness. The cafeteria on day 5 was unusually tense. Even the guards felt it, the electric anticipation of violence that made their hands drift toward their batons. Slug sat at his usual table, surrounded by his crew, but the crowd had thinned noticeably. Where he once commanded 15 loyal men, now only 7 remained. The others had quietly drifted away, their loyalty eroding as Marco's reputation grew. Marco entered with his tray, moving through the lunch line with the same calm composure he'd shown since arrival. He'd chosen a seat near the center of the room, not hiding in the corners, not challenging Slug directly, just existing in a space that used to belong exclusively to the bully's domain. Carlito's crew nodded as he passed. The Irish gave subtle acknowledgments. Even some of the Aryan Brotherhood members, who normally wouldn't acknowledge anyone outside their race, watched him with something resembling respect. Slug noticed. Of course he noticed. Still wearing my jacket, I see, Marco said to no one in particular, loud enough to carry. Several inmates chuckled. Slug's face reddened. Marco sat down and began eating his mystery meat and mashed potatoes, seemingly oblivious to the storm brewing across the cafeteria. But he'd positioned himself perfectly, back to the wall, clear sight lines to all exits, close enough to Slug to provoke, but far enough to have reaction time. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. The cafeteria returned to its usual chaos of conversations and clattering trays. Marco ate methodically, occasionally glancing at different groups, making mental notes of shifting alliances. Then Slug stood. The cafeteria quieted instantly, conversations dying mid-sentence. 300 pairs of eyes watched as Slug grabbed his tray, still half full of food, and walked toward Marco's table. You think you're smart, college boy? Slug's voice carried across the room. You think making friends with these animals makes you somebody? Marco looked up, his expression neutral. I think you're blocking my view of the exit. More laughter. Slug's grip tightened on his tray. You've been here less than a week, and you're already acting like you run this place. Let me remind you who's actually in charge. In one motion, Slug flipped his tray, sending mashed potatoes, gravy, and chunks of meat directly into Marco's face. The cafeteria exploded with reactions, gasps, laughter, shouts. Marco sat perfectly still, food dripping down his face and onto his orange jumpsuit. He slowly wiped the gravy from his eyes with a napkin, his movements deliberate and controlled. Feel better? Marco asked quietly. I feel like you need to remember your place, Slug sneered. You're nothing. You're nobody. And if you keep... Marco moved. He didn't explode with rage or throw wild punches. Instead, he stood with liquid grace and drove his palm upward into Slug's nose with surgical precision. The crack echoed through the cafeteria like a gunshot. Slug stumbled backward, blood streaming from his shattered nose, shock and pain flooding his face. His lieutenant, a muscular man called Tank, lunged forward to defend his boss. Marco sidestepped Tank's charge and delivered 2 quick strikes, one to the solar plexus that folded the bigger man in half, and one elbow to the back of his neck that dropped him to the floor like a puppet with cut strings. The entire sequence took maybe 4 seconds. Slug, still reeling and bleeding, reached for a plastic fork on the nearest table, trying to turn it into a weapon. Marco caught his wrist mid-swing and twisted, forcing Slug to his knees. The fork clattered to the floor. "You wanted me to remember my place?" Marco's voice was cold, empty of emotion. "Let me show you mine." He drove his knee into Slug's face. The bully collapsed onto the sticky cafeteria floor, blood pooling beneath his head, gasping for air through his ruined nose. Guards rushed in, batons raised, shouting for everyone to back away. But Marco had already stepped back, hands raised in a non-threatening gesture, his face still covered in Slug's thrown food. "He attacked first," Marco said calmly to the approaching guards. Everyone saw it. The senior guard, the same older man who'd witnessed the cell incident, surveyed the scene. Slug bleeding on the floor, his lieutenant unconscious, Marco standing without a scratch beyond the food covering his face. "Solitary." "Now," the guard ordered, but his tone lacked real anger. As guards surrounded Marco, escorting him toward the exit, he looked around the cafeteria one final time. What he saw made everything worth it. Carlito was standing, watching with approval. Finn O'Brien had a slight smile on his weathered face. Even inmates who'd never spoken to Marco were looking at him with new eyes, eyes that said they'd just witnessed power changing hands. But most importantly, in the far corner of the cafeteria, partially hidden behind a pillar, Marco spotted him for the first time. Rico Sandoval. Older now, with prison-gray skin and thinning hair, but unmistakably the man who'd sat at the DeLuca family table and plotted murder. Rico's face had gone pale, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth as he watched Marco being led away. Their eyes met for just a second, long enough for Marco to see the flash of recognition, the dawning horror, the primal fear. Rico knew. Somehow, impossibly, Rico Sandoval had just realized that Salvatore DeLuca's son was here, in Iron Heights, and coming for him. As the guards pushed Marco through the cafeteria doors towards solitary confinement, he smiled beneath the food covering his face. The real game was about to begin. Solitary confinement was a 6x8 concrete box with no windows, a steel toilet, and silence so complete it could drive men insane. Most inmates feared the hole more than any physical beating. Marco treated it like a meditation retreat. For the first 2 days, he did push-ups, practiced breathing exercises, and mentally reviewed every detail of his plan. On the 3rd day, the food slot opened and a tray slid through, but beneath the usual gray slop was a folded piece of paper. Marco glanced at the closed slot, then unfolded the note. The handwriting was crude but clear. "The guard at 2 a.m. is ours. O'Connell sends blessings." Marco smiled. Father O'Connell wasn't just a priest. He was a network. The old man had connections to guards whose fathers and brothers had worked for the DeLuca family in the old days. Loyalty, it seemed, outlasted death. That night at 2 a.m., the slot opened again. A different guard's voice, younger, whispered, "5 minutes. Make it count." "I need messages delivered," Marco said quietly. 3 of them. "I'm listening." Marco gave precise instructions. First message to Carlito. "Guard Patterson has a safety deposit box at First National, account 4782. Check who's been making deposits. You'll find you're missing 20%. Second message to Finn. "Wednesday's game is clean now. Willis got transferred after I filed an anonymous complaint about his sick mother needing him closer to home." Third message to a lone wolf named Deshawn, who controlled the prison commissary. "Slug owes you for 3 shipments. Collect now, or everyone thinks you're weak." The guard memorized everything and disappeared. Over the next 5 days, Marco's invisible hand reshaped Iron Heights from inside a concrete box. Carlito's crew investigated Patterson and discovered exactly what Marco had promised: bank records showing the guards' systematic theft. Patterson was found in the parking lot with 2 broken legs. His career and thieving operation permanently ended. Finn's poker game resumed, bigger than before, and he sent word through the prison grapevine: the DeLuca kid is a man of his word. Deshawn confronted Slug about the missing payment. When Slug couldn't produce the contraband or the money, Deshawn switched his supply lines to connect with Carlito's outside contacts Marco had quietly arranged. But Marco's masterstroke was simpler and more devastating. Through Father O'Connell's network, Marco sent word to the streets. The message reached his father's old allies, the ones who'd scattered when the FBI destroyed the DeLuca operation. The air is moving. Iron Heights is the first territory. Are you with us or against us? Outside the prison walls, old soldiers began to stir. Money flowed to the right families. Pressure applied to the right people. And inside Iron Heights, guards who'd been neutral suddenly had reasons to look the other way when Marco's allies made moves against Slug's crumbling empire. When Marco was finally released from solitary on day 12, the prison had transformed. The steel door opened, and harsh fluorescent light flooded his cell. Marco stepped out, blinking, his beard slightly longer, his eyes harder. The walk back to cell block D should have been ordinary. But as Marco moved through the corridors, something extraordinary happened. Inmates stopped what they were doing, not to threaten or challenge, but to acknowledge. Carlito's crew in the laundry room gave subtle nods. The Irish in the library stood as he passed. Even the Aryan Brotherhood members, who'd been neutral at best, stepped aside with grudging respect. When Marco entered the yard for afternoon recreation, the shift became visible. Slug stood in his usual spot, center yard, commanding position, but his crew had shrunk to just 4 men. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, like a king watching his kingdom crumble. Around the yard, the invisible boundaries had redrawn themselves. Carlito's crew had expanded into the east side. Finn's people controlled the north. And in the spaces between, different groups mingled in ways that would have been unthinkable 2 weeks ago. Marco walked to an empty bench and sat. He didn't claim territory or make speeches. He just existed, calm and present. Then Carlito approached. Then Finn. Then Deshawn. One by one, the faction leaders came to him, not with submission, but with the body language of equals acknowledging a superior strategist. Guard Patterson won't be a problem anymore, Carlito said, sitting beside Marco. The poker game thanks you, Finn added from his other side. Slug supply lines are dead, Deshawn confirmed. My people are with you. Across the yard, Slug watched this gathering with dawning horror. His lieutenant Tank, face still bruised from the cafeteria fight, whispered urgently in his ear. Slug's face twisted with rage, and something else, fear. Because everyone in Iron Heights now understood what had happened. The quiet kid who'd been humiliated on day 1 had systematically dismantled Slug's 5-year reign without throwing a single punch from inside solitary confinement. Marco DeLuca hadn't just survived Iron Heights. He'd conquered it. But Marco's eyes weren't on Slug. They scanned the yard until they found their real target, Rico Sandoval, standing alone near the basketball courts, looking decades older than his 53 years, watching Marco with the expression of a man who'd just seen his own death walking toward him. Rico turned and hurried back toward the cell blocks, practically running. Marco allowed himself a cold smile. Soon, he whispered. Very soon, Uncle Rico. The power had shifted. The board was set. Now came the endgame. Rico Sandoval hadn't slept in 3 days. Every shadow in his cell looked like Marco DeLuca. Every footstep in the corridor made his heart race. He'd requested protective custody, but the warden, suddenly less cooperative than usual, had denied it. He tried to get messages to his FBI handler, but the prison phones were malfunctioning. He was trapped, and he knew it. On day 16, Rico reported to the infirmary complaining of chest pains. It was a desperate move, but the infirmary had cameras, witnesses, and medical staff. Surely Marco wouldn't try anything there. The nurse, a bored woman named Helen who'd worked at Iron Heights for 20 years, took his blood pressure and temperature with mechanical efficiency. Probably anxiety, she diagnosed. I'll have the doctor check you tomorrow. Tomorrow? Rico's voice cracked. What about tonight? Tonight you rest. I'll give you something to help you sleep. She prepared a small paper cup with pills. Rico stared at the medication suspiciously. What is it? Lorazepam.
For anxiety.
Unless you want to keep having panic attacks. He swallowed the pills, his hands trembling. An hour later, as darkness settled over the prison, Rico lay on an infirmary bed, the medication making his thoughts fuzzy. The room held 6 beds, but tonight only 2 were occupied, him and an inmate who'd broken his leg in the workshop. The lights dimmed. Helen left for her break, replaced by an orderly Rico didn't recognize, a young man with dark eyes who moved with unsettling quiet. Rico's drowsy brain registered something wrong about the orderly, but the medication had already dulled his reflexes. The orderly approached, checked the other patient first, then moved to Rico's bed. When he leaned close to check the vitals monitor, Rico saw his face clearly in the dim light. His blood turned to ice. It wasn't an orderly. It was Marco DeLuca, wearing a stolen uniform. Rico tried to scream, but Marco's hand clamped over his mouth with crushing pressure. Hello, Uncle Rico, Marco whispered, his voice carrying 18 months of contained rage. Remember me? Little Marco, who you used to throw in the air when I was 5. Who called you family? Rico's eyes went wide with terror. He struggled, but the medication had sapped his strength, and Marco was younger, stronger, and fueled by pure vengeance. Marco removed his hand slowly. Scream, and I'll make this last hours instead of minutes. Your choice. Rico gasped for air, tears streaming down his face. Marco.
Please.
You don't understand. Then explain. Marco pulled a chair close, sitting like they were having a casual conversation. But his eyes were dead, emotionless. Explain why you poisoned my father. Explain why you sold our family to the FBI. Explain why you thought you'd get away with it. Your father, Rico's voice shook. He was losing control. The Colombians were moving in. The feds had 3 undercover agents in our crew. Salvatore wouldn't adapt, wouldn't compromise. He was going to get everyone killed or arrested. So you killed him instead. I saved myself. Rico's voice rose, then dropped when Marco's hand moved toward his throat. I saved everyone who cooperated. The FBI promised immunity, witness protection, new lives. New lives built on my father's corpse. Marco's voice could have frozen fire. You sat at our dinner table the night before you poisoned him. You looked my father in the eyes and called him Don. You hugged him. I had no choice. There's always a choice. You chose betrayal. You chose to watch him waste away, to let him think it was illness when it was murder. Do you know what his last words were? Marco leaned closer. He said, tell Marco to be better than me. Tell him to choose loyalty over everything. Rico's face crumpled. I'm sorry. God, Marco, I'm sorry. I was weak. I was scared. You were supposed to be family. Marco's voice finally cracked with emotion. Family doesn't betray family. Family doesn't poison family. Family doesn't sell out everything our fathers and grandfathers built. Please, Rico sobbed openly now. I'll testify against the FBI. I'll tell everyone what really happened. I'll help you rebuild. You'll do nothing. Marco stood, pulling something from his pocket, a small syringe. This is potassium chloride. Concentrated. It'll stop your heart in seconds and dissolve without a trace. The doctors will call it cardiac arrest. Natural causes. Marco, please. I'm begging you. Did my father beg? When the poison was eating him from inside, when he could barely breathe, when his own body betrayed him, did you give him mercy? Rico had no answer. Only tears. Marco grabbed Rico's arm, finding the vein with practiced ease. The DeLuca family sends its regards, Uncle Rico. See you in hell. Wait, Rico gasped. There's something you don't know. About Slug, about why I'm really here. But Marco had already pressed the plunger. Rico's eyes went wide. His mouth opened in a silent scream. His body convulsed once, twice, then went completely still. Marco checked for a pulse. Nothing. He positioned the body naturally, removed the syringe, and calmly walked to the supply closet where the real orderly lay unconscious, alive, but drugged. As alarms would eventually sound and doctors would pronounce Rico Sandoval dead of natural causes, Marco slipped back into the shadows of Iron Heights, his father's ghost finally beginning to rest. But Rico's final words echoed in his mind. There's something you don't know. What didn't he know? The prison yard at dawn was usually empty, a brief moment of peace before 300 inmates filled it with violence and tension. But this morning was different. Marco stood in the center of the yard, hands in his pockets, watching the sun paint the concrete walls orange and gold. He'd been waiting here since 5 a.m., knowing what was coming. Behind him, the yard began to fill, not with the usual chaos, but with purpose. Carlito's crew emerged first, taking positions along the east fence. Then Finn's Irish, spreading across the north. Deshawn's people, the Aryan Brotherhood, even the smaller factions, everyone moved with coordinated precision. They formed a circle around Marco, but they weren't protecting him. They were bearing witness. The cell block doors burst open and Slug stormed out, his face still purple with bruises from their cafeteria encounter. Behind him came his 4 remaining loyalists, desperate men with nothing left to lose. You, Slug's voice echoed across the yard. You think you can just take over my prison? You think killing Rico makes you somebody? Marco turned slowly. Rico's death was natural causes. The medical examiner confirmed it. Bullshit. Slug advanced, his crew following. You murdered him. Just like you're murdering everything I built here. But it ends now, DeLuca. Today, in front of everyone, I'm going to show them you're just another punk who got lucky. Marco didn't respond. He simply waited. Slug charged like an angry bull, his size and rage propelling him forward. His fists swung in a wide arc designed to take Marco's head off. Marco ducked under the blow and delivered 3 quick strikes, ribs, kidney, back of the knee. Slug stumbled but didn't fall, turning with surprising speed to grab Marco in a bear hug. For a moment, Slug's superior size seemed to matter. He lifted Marco off the ground, squeezing, trying to break ribs. But Marco had trained with men twice Slug's size. He drove his forehead into Slug's already broken nose, once, twice, 3 times. Blood exploded across both their faces. Slug's grip loosened, and Marco dropped, immediately sweeping his legs. Slug crashed to the concrete like a falling tree. His crew rushed forward, but they never reached Marco. Carlito's men intercepted 2 of them. Finn's people grabbed the 3rd. The 4th took one look at the unified response and simply backed away, hands raised. Marco stood over Slug, who was struggling to rise, blood streaming from his nose and mouth. Stay down, Marco said quietly. Go to hell. Slug spat blood and tried to stand. Marco's foot connected with his ribs, a calculated strike that cracked at least 2. Slug collapsed again, gasping. I said stay down. Around them, the circle of inmates had grown. Nearly everyone in the yard had gathered, drawn by the spectacle of power changing hands. Even the guards watched from the towers, making no move to intervene. Slug looked up at Marco, his eyes finally showing what he'd been hiding, pure, absolute fear. Please, he wheezed. Just end it. No, Marco crouched beside him. You're going to live, Slug. You're going to live and watch what happens when someone with vision runs this place. You're going to see everything you built get repurposed, improved, and expanded. And every day you're going to remember that you had a choice to work with me, and you chose pride instead. Marco stood and addressed the yard, his voice carrying to every corner. Iron Heights has new management. The old rules, fear, violence, chaos, those are finished. From now on, we operate like a business. Everyone gets a fair cut. No more skimming, no more random beatings, no more guards playing us against each other. He turned slowly, making eye contact with different faction leaders. Carlito, your supply lines stay yours, but you share intel with Finn's operations. Finn, your gambling expands, but you give Deshawn's commissary first access to new customers. Deshawn, you coordinate with everyone to make sure contraband distribution is efficient, not competitive. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, not of dissent, but of surprise. This wasn't a typical prison power grab. This was organization. Anyone who wants to keep fighting the old way, you're welcome to try. But ask Slug how that worked out. From the back of the crowd, a single person began to clap. Then another. Then dozens. Not because they loved Marco, but because he offered something Slug never had: stability and profit over chaos and fear. Near the chapel entrance, Father O'Connell watched with conflicted eyes. He made the sign of the cross and whispered a prayer for Marco's soul. As the crowd began to disperse, returning to their morning routines under a new regime, Marco walked to the fence line and stared through the chain link at the world beyond. His reflection stared back, young, hard, covered in blood that wasn't entirely his own. He barely recognized himself. He pulled out the photograph of his father one final time. The edges were worn, almost transparent now. "I finished it, Papa," he whispered.
Rico is dead.
The DeLuca name means something again.
But
He paused, remembering Rico's final words. "There's something you don't know about Slug." What had Rico meant? Why would Slug matter beyond being an obstacle? Marco tucked the photograph away as Carlito approached. "Boss, we got a message from the outside. Your father's old crew. They're ready to move when you are."
boss.
Not Marco. Not DeLuca.
Boss. Marco nodded slowly.
"Tell them to wait. I have 16 months left on my sentence. When I walk out of here, I walk out in control of the entire prison system's drug and protection networks across 3 states. That's worth more than early freedom." Carlito grinned. "Your father would be proud." "My father is dead because he trusted the wrong people," Marco corrected. "I won't make that mistake." As the sun fully rose over Iron Heights Penitentiary, Marco DeLuca stood where Slug had once ruled, master of a concrete kingdom, his father's vengeance complete. But in the back of his mind, Rico's dying words echoed like a warning he couldn't quite hear. The game was won. But somehow, Marco suspected, a much larger game had just begun. The end.